Welcome to the third example hand. This is a Sixmax online cash game with blinds of $5 and $10, and all players have at least $1,000 at the table. My client is the hero on the big blind and is a very loose player with extremely wide bluffing and calling ranges. We're going to examine this from the perspective of the villain who is sat on the cutoff. I'll simply refer to us on the cutoff and the villain on the big blind. I know it's labeled hero, but you need to think of the big blind as the villain. We can skip the T from tops app god H as we're playing cash and start by asking how many players are at the table. In this case, only 4. Remember, if you're ever playing online and you see a player sitting out, then you might need to adjust that number. 4 players means wide ranges and plenty of action. What are the profiles of my opponents? Here we have a solid tag on the small blind, but 2 fish on the button and big blind. The button is a weak, tight, passive player, sometimes referred to as a mouse, and the big blind is a lag bordering on maniac. The focus in this hand will be on the maniac. What about statistical evidence? I'm not going to display heads-up display information as it contains a ton of full ring game data as well as Sixmax, so it can be very misleading. Suffice to say, the big blind plays way too many hands and is going to showdowns far too often with a low win rate. That's the information we're going to need in this hand. What specific weaknesses can I gather from the statistics? Actually, there are a lot of frequency issues for the 2 fish at the table. During the pre-flop stages, I'll tend to focus on the pre-flop issues, and for the big blind, the main weakness is simply playing too many hands, mainly calling too often. The 2 fish are likely thinking on level 1 most of the time, whereas the small blind will be on level 3 or even higher. This means the fish are only thinking about what they have and not what their opponents have. Are micro images relevant? No player has shown evidence of playing differently to their normal style. If I got in a hand with the thinking small blind player, I'd consider micro images more carefully, but it's not usually needed against players who aren't paying enough attention to the table dynamics. What position am I in? I'm in the cutoff, and I've noted the positions of the villains. It's pretty simple with just 4. I'm keen to play poker with these opponents, so I might be tempted to open slightly wider than usual, but just slightly. What's my stack size? I have a starting stack of 100 bigs, which is actually the smallest at the table, so I'm guaranteed to have the effective stack. This deep, I'm not thinking about pot geometry, but I will select starting ranges with more suited connected hands and fewer vulnerable Broadway hands. The remaining stack size questions are not relevant to cash games, so we can press on to after the cards are dealt, app, god, H. What is the action in front of me? Well, I'm under the gun, so we can skip that. What are my pot odds? Pot odds for limping are always 40% when you're first in, but you should not be limping anyway, so you don't really need to think about this when acting first. You should know what odds you present to your opponents when you raise different sizes. If I raise 3 big blinds, I know I present odds of 40%, 36% and 31% respectively to the button, small blind and big blind. These numbers are always true when the game structure is standard. What's my GTO range here for raising from the cutoff? Something between 23 and 27% is good. Some players will steal a bit more often here, but that's exploitative, not necessarily GTO. What about the GTO responses for the villains? If you've done this as practice off the table, you'll be able to recall it when playing in real time. The button should be able to call or raise with only about half the range of the cutoff, so just 12%. It's best to 3-bet the majority of that range, so perhaps 3-bet 8%, call 4%. I won't go into the details of which hands go in which range, but the frequency is the most important thing. If the button folds, the small blind has better pot odds, so despite being out of position, should call 16% and 3-bet 9%. That's quite a lot of hands here from the worst place on the table. Would you fold too often in this spot? I think I probably do. Finally, if it falls to the big blind, what should he 3-bet and call with? Due to pot odds, he should call with almost everything, perhaps 77%, 3-betting another 7 or 8% on top of that. And those 3-bet hands would be 7-7 plus, ace-10 suited plus, ace-jack off plus, and also king-queen suited, possibly king-queen off. Having defined the GTO ranges, I now want to know how I think these opponents would actually respond to a raise. These are quite different, I think, from the GTO ranges. I expect the button will call with too many hands and 3-bet probably close to correctly. I expect the small blind will call with not enough hands, but 3-bet correctly. And I expect the big blind, despite being a loose player, in this particular spot, I think he'll probably fold a bit too much. This judgment comes from experience. I could be wrong, but I'd also expect him to 3-bet about the right percentage. So if I assume I'm correct and that the big blind will fold 40% of the time or more, I should adjust my pre-flop raise from the GTO 25-ish% to something nearer 30%, which is probably what a lot of good players would choose here anyway. I'll go ahead and make this adjustment. What's my hand? It's actually Jack 10 of hearts. It's towards the bottom end of my raising range, but it's clearly in there. So I go ahead and raise to 3 big blinds. What's the action in front of me now? Well, let's have a look what happens. The button and small blind both fold, and then the big blind raises to 9.5 big blinds. What are my pot odds? Exactly 2-1, or 33%. We already defined the big blind's 3-bet range as a likely 7 or 8%, so we can lean on those thoughts now as we already had them when we were thinking one move ahead. Now, facing this 8% 3-bet range from the big blind, what would be the optimal response for us in the cutoff? From our opening 30%, taking into account the pot odds, we could call with only about 11% and 4-bet just a narrow 2%. So we'd be folding actually just slightly more than 50% of the time to the 3-bet. That's more than normal because we widened our opening range. The hands we call with are pocket pairs, strong aces, suited connectors, plus a few more suited hands. We can 4-bet with ace-ace, king-king, ace-king suited, some combos of ace-king off, and if you really want to, an occasional balancing hand. Is there any reason for deviating? Here, I'm thinking about whether to stay involved with perhaps a few extra hands to exploit my opponent's post-flop weaknesses. So if you wanted to widen that calling range from 11% to perhaps 14%, that would be acceptable. Having done the range analysis and the adjustment of my range, I'm thinking about my hand, which is Jack 10 of hearts, and this clearly fits into my calling range, so I go ahead and make the call. How many players are in the hand? Well, we're heads up. Is this opponent passive or aggressive? Difficult to answer because he doesn't like folding much, but he can be over aggressive, probably calls too much. So he's also over passive. So it's a difficult question to answer. Statistically, this is backed up by a normal post-flop aggression factor, but a high aggression percentage. He's exactly the type of opponent who is best defined by the went to showdown percentage and $1 at showdown percentage stats, and also the aggression percentage stat. These bits of information show us that our opponent is doing a lot of things post-flop except folding. What's his level of thinking? I need to assume he's just thinking about his own hand. There's no need for me to overcomplicate my actions. This may mean simplifying the GTO solutions. What's the stack to pot ratio? The pot is nearly 20 big blinds and I have around 90 big blinds left, so it's 4.5. That's a small SPR because of the 3-bet pot. It's not necessarily ideal for my hand. What's my position? I have position post-flop. What about previous actions? Well, we closed the action pre-flop, so there are none to go over. The villain will be the post-flop aggressor out of position and is likely to continue with a c-bet most of the time. What's the board texture? Jack of clubs, 8 of hearts, 10 of spades. It's a rainbow board, plenty of straight draws, neither wet nor dry. It's a board that will often produce action. Who has range advantage? He has a slight equity advantage going into the flop with an 8% range against my 11%. We both have all the sets and all the overcards, but he has more overpairs. What about the post-flop action? He goes ahead and makes a 45% c-bet. What are my pot odds? Well, if he bets half the pot, they're 25%, so let's say 23%. What's the villain's GTO range for c-betting? He's out of position with a very marginal equity advantage, so his strategy should definitely be mixed here. The optimal c-bet percentage is 70%, weighted towards his strong hands and overpairs, semi-bluffing with ace-king off, king-queen off, and with the 3 combinations of ace-king suited and king-queen suited that have a backdoor flush draw. So the jack of clubs, 8 of hearts, 10 of spades, those 3 suits, if he's got suited combos of ace-king or king-queen that match those suits, he can go ahead and semi-bluff with them. He should check middle pair, low pairs, 9-9, 7-7, plus sometimes ace-queen off, ace-queen suited, and the occasional set for balance. It's a real mix and a mixed strategy for c-betting, but also typical. What about my GTO ranges to respond? Well, I'll choose a raise size of 29 big blinds. I can actually raise with 20% of my hands against a c-bet here. That's 26 combos, which include all my sets, all my combos of Jack 10, 3 combos of King Queen suited, with all the backdoor flush draws, and sometimes Ace Queen and Queen 10 suited. That's a lot of hands here, including those semi-bluffing hands that you could also just call with. We should fold out our worst 30% of hands, which are the pocket pairs and the bad aces. But we can continue by calling with the other 50%, which is just mainly just the rest of the broadways. So he continues with 70% of his hands, and we continue with 70% of our hands. Often the right solution when you're playing GTO play, 70% is a go-to number for frequency. If you're not sure, it's a go-to number. What reasons do I have for deviating from GTO play? My opponent will probably call too much when I raise, so I'm in favor of raising with fewer drawing hands. I'm still going to raise with the best ones like King Queen suited, but just not all of them. That's probably the only adjustment I would make here. What's my hand? Well, I actually have top 2 pair, so I'm definitely going to be raising for value. I want to choose a sizing that will allow me to shove on most turn cards, and 29 big blinds is going to allow that. So I go ahead and raise to 29 big blinds, and my opponent calls. I circle back to think about any information on my opponent that might help. He goes to showdowns too often. Perhaps he has an overpair or a drawing hand. As long as the turn card is good, I can safely shove. There's 78 big blinds in the middle and 62 big blinds left. There's 1 bet left. I like a large bet here rather than too small. I like going all in on the turn when I feel there are drawing hands in my opponent's range. What was the previous action? Well, my opponent called my raise on the flop and completed the betting round. That means I ought to reassess his range if I get time. I feel I've done that already. He would have 3-bet shoved his sets to protect them, so I can only think he has a marginal hand or a drawing hand. I'd be very surprised if he bets at the turn, but it will be a bad sign if he does. The turn card is the 2 of clubs. How does this affect things? It's perfect for me to go ahead with my strategy of shoving the turn. A blank turn was always ideal and simplifies proceedings. He likely has some equity in the pot, so shoving has to be optimal, as otherwise he may get close to the right odds for calling. Big blind checks to me. What pot odds will I present him? He'd need 31% equity to call the all-in, just slightly less than a pot-sized all-in. What's his GTO range for checking? Hard to say now. His line is very odd. He should not really have called the previous bet, but I feel he probably has to check everything now. What about my range? I should aim for a 70% frequency for shoving, which would be a handful of draws, such as King-Queen, Jack-10 suited, and sets. I don't have much left. If I've got here with a few weak draws, I could perhaps check them back. I should still consider deviations. If he's going to call too much, maybe shoving the drawing hands is a bad move. Perhaps check a few more of them back. If I deviate, that's probably the only change I would make. I actually have top 2 pair, and that's easily good enough to just shove. And my opponent called with 2 black queens. It was a tough hand for him to play. When you're out of position on the flop, facing a raise like this one, it's better to simply choose 3-bet or fold with all of your hands. Trying to call and negotiate the turn out of position makes it very hard to win the pot through non-showdown. For that reason, he'd have been better advised simply to 3-bet shove the hand on the flop. When faced by that big raise to 29 big blinds on the flop, he was being put in a decision, and he needed to make a more clear decision rather than choose the passive call. For the final example hand, we'll tackle an online sit and go hand. See you then.